buddies, this is Carmen and welcome to another Chatty Crochet with me. In this video series, I will be crocheting something while talking about a random topic, like we're just hanging out. And maybe you're crocheting too. This is definitely not a tutorial video. First, I'd like to talk about my blanket process. For June's blanket, I did a baby blocks blanket. But since I didn't want to be working on a whole blanket in my lap during heat waves, I did them in blocks. But that's not the pattern or the way you're supposed to do it, but I still like it. I started putting it together, but again, it got too hot, so I'll just put it together during the cooler months. Then I started my July blanket, which is a simple lap blanket. I love scrap busting blankets, and this blanket was made especially for blocks, so let's get started. I'm going to switch to the top-down view, and I'll start crocheting. Let's go! This is only the second time I'm doing a top-down video for crocheting. Again, I don't want to make a tutorial video, so I'm just going at my own speed, which my fiance Taylor says looks pretty fast. Last time I did have to speed the video up because apparently I thought I had talked a lot, but I actually don't talk that much when doing voiceover, but this time there's a lot to say, so there's no issue there. First, a little bit more about the blanket. I'm using a bunch of scrap yarns that I had, so I'll list them on the screen if I know what they are, but some I may not know, as some are from my grandma's stash. Anyway, I will go ahead and start talking about the topic today, which is the podcast that I listened to during 2020. This will include miniseries, podcasts as a whole, and some specific individual podcast episodes that were really great. As a warning, or more like a caveat before I go forward, I listen to all my podcasts from oldest episode on the feed to newest, no matter how old the episode is. So some of the podcast episodes will be from several years ago, and honestly, it's been an escape this year with this listening method. Thinking and listening to events and issues from several years ago allowed me to forget the craziness that was 2020. Also, there will be spoilers, whatever that may mean. Anyway, I listen to a lot of true crime, so let's start there. These will be the limited or mini-series that I listen to. The Bad Batch was a show about stem cell treatments and how one company was not providing good stem cells for those treatments. The series was really interesting because I think it's the first one where the perpetrator was on the podcast talking about his scheme. Really fascinating, but that dude is a total sociopath. Case Closed Season 3. This was the Amish season. It was interesting to learn about a community that is not widely talked about, but it just makes me really mad when a man seduces a woman to kill his wife. In general, it's a good rule that if you're not up to the task you're asking someone else to do, you don't get to ask for it. Dirty John was about a con artist who seduces and marries an interior designer and all the drama that entails, including family members being suspicious and her own suspicions. There's also a Netflix series, and season 1 is based on this podcast series. I still haven't seen it though. I'm waiting until I forget all the details before watching it. Dr. Death Season 1. This season was about a surgeon who basically thinks he knows what he's doing, when actually he doesn't. This will make you really mad about the system that keeps doctors working, because this guy was reported several times and he just transferred from hospital to hospital. A series on Peacock was made and is out now, I believe, in late 2020. A second season was added to the podcast, and just now there's a season 3 as well. The first 2 episodes are out as I am recording this. I plan on listening to those later, but I haven't started them yet. Park Predators. This series was about killers who killed in or escaped to national parks. I liked a lot of these episodes, but many ended with mysteries, which I don't like. You'll learn I like having finished stories and knowing what happened to the killer. However, one of the standout episodes for me was episode 5, The Survivalist, who led a double life. He had 2 wives and 2 houses, and when those lives came together one day, he committed a triple murder and has been on the run ever since. That's right, they still don't know where this guy is. I hope a mountain lion or something just as ferocious got him early in his escape, but we just don't know. Predator. This series was about Australia's first convicted serial killer. It involves the death of a child, so make sure you're in the right frame of mind when listening to this. This was a really interesting series because it included interviews from the victim's mother, and they were very emotional. Room 20. This series was about a man in a coma who was called 66 Garage. Yes, 66 Garage. Because he didn't have ID on him. The reporter recording the podcast is really nice and relatable, and she quit her job to focus on identifying 66 Garage's real name. I won't tell you what happens, but the whole series is really interesting. The Sneak Season 1 is about a man who robs an armored car and gets away on an inner tube down a river. I had heard about this case on a different podcast that I'll talk about later, but this season goes in depth with interviews and details in how the perpetrator was caught. I don't think anyone is very sympathetic in this series, but you'll have to let me know what you think. There's already a season 2 and 3, but I haven't gotten through those yet. The Thing About Pam is a series about the murder of Betsy Faria, whose husband is initially convicted of her murder. However, it isn't always a husband, as we come to suspect, and the story is so much more than husband kills wife. This is another series that is going to be turned into a miniseries. The Woodland Murders is a series about the murder of 4 people. The crime scene is said to have been bloodier than the Tate LaBianca murders, which sounds like it would just be chaos. The story includes robbery, drugs, porn, and of course, a brutal and violent murder. This was the first time I had heard about this case, so it was interesting to hear about, especially since this happened before I was born. This case was turned into a movie back in 2003, and it's called Wonderland. Carrie Fisher is in it, so I totally want to watch it, but it looks like it's not actually a great movie. Those are all the true crime miniseries, so let's talk about the other true crime podcasts that are always in my queue. I'll break them down into tiers. First, my top tier favorite podcasts. Those second tier ones that provide the good details or interesting and new cases. Third tier ones that are still pretty enjoyable. And finally, the podcasts that I'm iffy about. My top tier favorite true crime podcasts. Bloody Murder. They're funny, they're sweary, and they also like having a fully wrapped story. They try to focus on Australian true crime, or at least cases that aren't covered a lot. They usually both share a unique true crime story, but sometimes it's just one long episode that they talk about. They also have a great segment called Bloody Oz, where they share a silly Australian crime. I just heard they're on indefinite hiatus though. I'm so sad. Court Junkie. Even though the court part of the criminal justice system is not my favorite part of the proceedings, I think the host makes the proceedings really interesting and provides a lot of detail to keep me interested. The one episode that really stuck in my mind is Emily Doe and the Stanford rape case. Being from the area, of course, I had heard of the case and voted in the recall of the judge. However, I didn't know all the details, and that episode was really informative. Criminal, one of my oldest true crime podcasts that I still have in my queue. The podcast isn't always about a murder. Any crime can be highlighted here for an episode. One of their lighter episodes was called Who's There? And it was about mistakes made, such as a couple was house sitting and heard unfamiliar noises coming from the bathroom. They saw a shadow under the door and called the police. The police spent a while trying to coax the intruder from the bathroom, and finally they breached the door, only to discover a rogue Roomba. Once Upon a Crime, my favorite true crime podcast. I love everything about this podcast. The host, her voice and her research. The fact that the episodes are sectioned into themes, that each case is super interesting, and very often one I have not heard of before. Some of the more interesting themes were Sick and Murdered, which had an episode about Munchausen by Internet, Academy Award-winning Crimes, which had an episode about the life of Dr. Hang S. Noor, and of course the holiday episodes like Halloween Tales and the 12 Crimes of Christmas. I'm just seriously in love with this podcast. Scam Goddess, a new true crime podcast, is solely about scams. They talk about little scams sent in by listeners, like stealing credit cards through drive-through lanes, and historical scams, like the adoption of a 9-year-old Ukrainian who is actually 22, or about Theranos' Elizabeth Holmes. This show is a lot lighter than the heavier murder podcasts out there, and it's becoming a fast favorite. It's definitely on the more fun side of true crime podcasts. There's a lot of laughing and talking. True Crime Obsessed, a really fun and amusing podcast. These two hosts have really great chemistry. They watch a true crime documentary or crime adjacent, and talk about the documentary in depth, often with jokes about the documentary itself or with the filmmaker, but they are always respectful to the victims. I haven't seen most of these documentaries, but they really go scene by scene, so it's easy to understand not only the documentary, but the case at large as well. The one that sticks in my head was definitely There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, but Tall Hot Blonde and Holy Hell were also really good. Second tier, podcasts that provide good details and interesting new cases. Crime Beat, a Canadian-based true crime show hosted by a crime journalist who is localized in Calgary. These episodes have all been cases that she has covered previously, and she mostly covers cases that are finished or have been closed. Crime After Crime, a podcast that features 2 crime YouTubers. They tell cases based on a theme each month. Listeners can vote each episode to see which host told it best. I like these episodes. They're short and not always murders, so it's usually light. This is where I originally heard the story from the Sneak Season 1. They always have fun or interesting themes like Craigslist crimes or criminal doctors. For July's episode, they did a stolen on the 4th of July. Dark Poutine, another podcast about true crime in Canada, and this one is more down to earth. The hosts share feelings towards the episode, and if an episode or case has been really hard to talk about or research, they share that process. I really appreciate the honesty and insight that they provide. Extraordinary Stories Pod, a podcast about interesting stories, crime-related or adjacent. It's hosted by a Scot, and the accent is amazing. He picks out these stories and he always tells them very emphatically and enthusiastically. He's a great storyteller. Let's Talk About True Crime, a podcast that is hosted by the same person who hosts Once Upon a Crime. In this podcast, she brings on a guest and they watch a true crime documentary or miniseries. I really like this series, and I'm sad that it looks like this died during the pandemic. I said, goddamn. A podcast where the 2 hosts share a true crime story. This one is nice because the hosts are friendly and mostly no nonsense. They share something personal that happened to them that made them say goddamn, but other than that, they mostly dive straight into their stories. The banter is kept at a minimum, and I can't think of a time when they went on a long tangent. Minds of Madness, a newish addition to my queue. This one goes in depth into one case and breaks down all the details into parts. The premise is that it goes in what goes into the mind of a person who kills. The first episode is still the most memorable to me. Gary and Jody Plauché. The whole episode alone really cemented my subscription to the podcast. My Favorite Murder, one of the classics. The 2 hosts each share a story, and there's a lot of banter and tangents and laughter. Now, I've heard that there's some drama going on in the fandom right now, but my listening is not even close to recent. Generally, I find their energy really fun, and I like their chemistry. It feels like I'm talking to a friend about true crime, and that's what I like about it. Obscura, another newish addition to my queue. This podcast does a deep dive into the details, and I think talks about lesser-known cases. One episode that I listened to was the Hart family crash, a case I had heard of but didn't know all the details. It was really interesting and extremely sad. The Asian Madness podcast is a podcast centered around true crime from Asia, as well as some superstitions and paranormal tales as well. There's definitely stories I had never heard of on here before, and I really like the host's deadpan tone. I'm not a huge fan of the supernatural stories, but I like hearing the superstitions behind them. Third tier, podcasts that are still enjoyable, but there's something about them that bugs me. Maybe they do cold cases more often than I like, or simply I just don't like them as much. Canadian True Crime, another Canadian true crime podcast. I started this show in 2020, and I picked the murder of Tim Bosma and the killer Dylan Millard to begin with. It's a 6-part series, so it's a good diving in point. However, this podcast tends to be more background noise instead of active listening for me. I'm not sure what it is about the podcast, though. Southern Fried True Crime, a podcast that focuses on the true crime stories out of the southern United States. This host is from Tennessee, so she also has a nice southern accent that's pleasant to listen to. I just started this podcast this year, and it's been a really nice addition to my listening queue because there's been a lot of cases that I've never heard of. However, this podcast also does cases that are open-ended, so that's been my only misgiving. They Walk Among Us, a podcast about true crime cases centered in and around the United Kingdom and Great Britain. another podcast that does a deep dive into the victims and also the background of the perpetrators as well. I'm not sure why, but the episodes don't tend to stick in my mind after listening to them, but I do enjoy the episodes when listening. True Crime All the Time, a podcast about true crime with two hosts that take turns talking about just one story. They also have another podcast that focuses on unsolved cases, but I don't like unsolved cases, so I don't listen to that one. This is another one where the cases just don't stay in my head after I've listened to them. I'm not sure why. True Crime Campfire, a podcast about true crime cases that breaks them into multi-parters. I just started this in 2020, so it's fairly new to me. I only listened to 10 episodes last year, which amounted to just one case. True Crime Island. This podcast has a lot of interesting true crime cases, and I really like the host. He gets really angry and emotional for the victims. However, where I am in the listening, he sometimes does special edition episodes where the cases featured are shorter and are often still ongoing cases. I'm not a huge fan of these episodes and would prefer all the cases just be regular island episodes. True Crime New Zealand. This podcast features cases in and around New Zealand. It also includes some history as well. I really like this podcast. The team behind it seems to be really respectful of the Maori and indigenous peoples of New Zealand, but again, for some reason, the cases just don't stick with me as well as other podcasts. Wine and Crime, a podcast that pairs a true crime theme, arson, peeping toms, Munchausen syndrome, with comedy and wine. In this, there are 3 hosts. One who gives some history or a description of the theme with some short examples, and then the other 2 each share a story they found. I find the host really fun and entertaining, but I don't tend to laugh with them. 4th tier, podcast that I'm iffy about. Crime Junkie, one of the more controversial shows that I listen to. This podcast gained popularity quickly, but it was revealed that they plagiarized some of their episodes from other podcasts, Reddit posts, and other sources, some being my favorite podcasts. They still have a huge following from what I understand, and I do listen with a grain of salt now, knowing that they don't have a great work ethic. Eventually, I do see myself unsubscribing from this. They do a lot of mysteries and unsolved cases that are really interesting, but just end up frustrating me. The Serial Killer Podcast, a podcast about, yes, serial killers. This one isn't a favorite for me. I'm not a fan of his storytelling or his interview methods. But basically, this podcast is a super deep dive into serial killers, both known and unknown serial killers. The known serial killer episodes are good for me because that usually means they're cases that are finished and the killers are caught. And the podcast covers the well-known serial killers, of course, as well as the not-so-well-known ones. Sword and Scale, the podcast that is probably the most problematic on my list that I still listen to. Let's just say the podcast host was or is extremely problematic. I heard that there might be a new host. I would just suggest looking up the gossip if you've never heard of this before. Anyway, this podcast I know I'll eventually stop listening to. I think I'm just waiting until the drama starts so I can hear how they address it on the show and what the podcast sounds like after the drama. I'm just really curious about the whole situation. Anyway, I've still got a while to go before I catch up. I actually wanted to give it up way before this because of other reasons, but I wasn't picky about my podcast listening before this, and now I'm getting pickier, I guess. Maybe not that picky, though, considering it's taking me forever to get off this podcast and the Serial Killer podcast. And finally, these are all the non-true crime podcasts that I listened to in 2020. I'll bundle these up into categories so they go a little quicker. I'll start with a pandemical podcast since it was 2020. So first up is Stay F. Homekins. Paul F. Tompkins is my favorite comedian, and during 2020, the podcast was him and his wife talking about their week and the weekly happenings of the world during the pandemic. It really felt like I was hanging out with a friend each week, and that feeling was needed during the pandemic. I listened to a bunch of California and Bay Area based podcasts hosted by KQED. The ones I've tried and kept are The Bay Curious, and California Report. I'm still several years behind, so for me, during the pandemic, it was kind of like traveling around California without moving, and it was just nice to listen to. I also listened to a KQED news podcast for my daily news. Speaking of daily news, I listen to Curiosity Daily, The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and Weird AF News during 2020 to keep up with the daily happenings. I also listened to all of I Tell My Husband the News before they stopped. These shows were the only shows I listened to backward. I listened to the newest shows first and then go back and listened to the older ones. The For Real podcast was also semi-news related and it focused on Black issues in America. However, it is no longer updating from what I can tell. For some much-needed humor, I had Comedy Bang Bang, The Dollop and The Dollop UK, Spontanea Nation, Never Not Funny, Stop Podcasting Yourself, and Threedom. Those last three feel like I'm just hanging out with some friends, just like Stay of Homekins, except where I am, I'm not near 2020, so it was just a little escape from reality. Also, I just started Hello from the Magic Tavern, My Brother and Me, and The Neighborhood Listen last year, and those three were fun additions to my queue. Two more comedy-adjacent podcasts are Who Charted and You Made It Weird. These two often have comedians on as guests, and the hosts are funny, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them specifically comedy podcasts. I also started and finished You Know Me with Eugene Cordero, and that podcast was such a delight. In the vein of the other two, it has a host and guests who are funny, but I wouldn't call it a comedy podcast. Moving on to some pop culture and movie podcasts, I listened to Malton on Movies, Pop Culture Bento, Pop Rocket, and The Popcast. Malton on Movies is a movie podcast from movie critic Leonard Maltin. Pop Culture Bento is the nerdier side of pop culture, so they talk about video games and comic books. However, it is no longer updating from what I can tell. Pop Rocket was a fun weekly update between the hosts, and they would often talk about topical pop culture. This podcast also has been discontinued. And the hosts of the Popcast debate or talk about a different pop culture topic each week, not necessarily topical. Minority Corner is also semi-pop culture related, with some history snuck in there, with emphasis on issues that minority and marginalized communities face. I just started listening to that in 2020, and I really like it. I'm also going to say that the Cracked podcast is also a pop culture podcast about a large range of topics. And it ended rather abruptly, and there's a little drama about the end of the podcast, but if you have Stitcher Premium, you can listen to the 7-year archive of it like I am. Now, I found I really like history if we're talking about something weird or interesting. So, Behind the Bastards, The History Chicks, The Memory Palace, Sawbones, Stuff You Missed in History Class, and You're Dead to Me are all good listens. And similarly, Ologies is a good podcast that talks about science and jobs that you're unfamiliar with. I'm not a big food podcast person, but I have some podcasts about food that are fun to listen to. The Empty Bowl is a meditative podcast about cereal and cereal news. This is a fun podcast, even though I'm not a big cereal person. Face Jam is a comedy podcast that talks about the for limited time foods that some restaurants have. The hosts are fun to listen to, even though it's a little chaotic at times. And the Sporkful podcast is a podcast about food-related discussions. For example, how many toppings can go into a grilled cheese before it's a panini? What style of ice cube is your favorite? Do you like weird flavors of potato chips? I love these types of discussions because they can be so varied and personable. I also have a handful of game-like podcasts. Factorious is a game show and a podcast, and it's a fun premise, but I think it would be better if it gave the listener more time to guess. Hey Riddle Riddle is a podcast that features riddles and seems to be the only one since I couldn't find another one. It's kind of fun, but the hosts do little role plays of the silly scenarios they come up with for the riddle, and I'm less interested in those. Lastly, the No Nonsense Trivia Podcast is a very good trivia podcast. They give ample time for the listener to guess, and often even discuss if the question is a good trivia question. However, they do spend a chunk of time talking about their own games in real life, so I usually skip that and go straight to the questions. And another one of my indulgences is Pens and Planning. So I have one podcast for each, the Pen Addict podcast and Planners and Wine. Both are good because you can catch up on the news in both categories, and all the hosts are very friendly and personable. And lastly, some good old-fashioned stories. Cabinet of Curiosities, let's talk about myths, baby. Lore, myths and legends. These are all podcasts that talks about myths and legends and superstitions, and they're all good fun. Being the scaredy cat that I am, lore is a little on the scary side, but I'm sure if you're a normal person, you'll be okay. Slightly different from those are LeVar Burton Reads and New Yorker Fiction. Both of those feature the host or guest reading a short story aloud to the listener. LeVar Burton can do no wrong in my eyes, so that podcast is so good. The New Yorker Fiction podcast is a little dry, but still great stories. On an entirely different note, but it's still essentially podcasts with storytelling, are The Adventure Zone, Thrilling Adventure Hour, and Welcome to Night Vale. These are more fun for me than the rest of the story podcasts, but I guess that depends on your definition of fun. The Adventure Zone is basically a D&D role-playing podcast, and it features the brothers from My Brother and Me, as well as their father. I'm not a huge role-playing fan, but the stories that they tell are really emotional and wonderful, and it's easy for me to follow. They also have graphic novels that are out, so you should definitely check those out if the story interests you, but you'd rather not listen to people play D&D. The Thrilling Adventure Hour is a fake old radio program with several really funny shows, my two favorite being Sparks, Nevada and Beyond Belief. They also have a graphic novel out, and I wish there were more volumes, but right now I think it's just the one. This episode has uploads from the vault, which are recordings of old performances, and also new episodes recorded in a studio. The old performances are still really good, even though they're basically reruns I've listened to already. And the new ones feel fresh, since they're new stories, but have less character since they're recorded inside a studio. I just want more Sparks, Nevada. Lastly, Welcome to Night Vale is a scripted radio show set in the fictional desert city of Night Vale. The plots are weird and just a little creepy, but overall it's a really unique show, and I like that a lot. And that's it, you guys. I'll cut back to the forward view, and let's see how many squares I ended up crocheting. Okay, so that was such a long video. I crocheted 4 blocks during that time. I already had 20 blocks, so I probably just need a million more blocks to do. No, it's probably more like 70, but still a lot. Please let me know what you think of this video. I really like doing the top-down stuff, so if you like it too, don't be afraid to give me some feedback. And thanks for watching, everybody. Bye!